Good morning, ladies, women in agriculture. Welcome to our first webinar where we are hosting more than 357 ladies today on our Kwanalu webinar. This is in collaboration with SA Cane Growers, and it is just so exciting to be with you all today in your homes. I'm sure some of you have your slippers on, some of you might have your jerseys on. A few of us managed to get some lipstick on this morning for the first time in a while, which was really great. So yes, I'd just like to welcome you. We are busy connecting our ladies from across the province, and in fact we've got a lot of guests from outside of our province. So I would like to welcome every one of you to our Women in Agriculture webinar today. We have an outstanding lineup of speakers, and I hope that you've all had a quick run to the bathroom before we went live, and that you'll be spending the morning with us and enjoying listening to people that are going to connect, collaborate, and inspire each one of us today. This webinar, this process started as an idea a little while ago, and we decided to take it live by creating a form which more than 300 ladies have completed, and I hope you've all taken the time to go and have a look at our wall of recognition, which is up on our Kwanalu website, www.kwanalu.coza. You are welcome to go and have a look and just be inspired. I've had a tough time over the last couple of days, and it's the most inspirational thing to go and look at that wall and read the stories of people that are involved, women involved in agriculture. So it's a really exciting time for us. We're going to be able to chat. We're going to take questions. We've got on your Zoom platforms, you'll see that we've got a Q&A platform. You're welcome to jot your questions in there. As I said, we've got over 357 ladies that had registered with us this morning before we went live. So I've got a team with me here at Kwanalu, at Cane Growers, and we'll be assisting you as best as you can. I'll just introduce you to my team. I've got Dr. Kathy Hurley from SA Cane Growers, who's the Executive Director. I have got Makud Lamini, who is the Development Manager here at SA Cane Growers. I have got our Kwanalu PR team, Cindy Kidger and Tegan Mitchell, and Delise Werter from our Kwanalu office, who is my PA. So we've got an all-women team, and we've got an all-women speakers line up this morning. And as I say, you are all welcome to participate. We will try and answer your questions, and our speakers, I'm sure, are going to inspire each one of you as we listen to them this morning. I trust that everyone is comfortable. If I can just make sure that I'm just going to just check on some admin quickly, make sure that we are nearly all connected, and then we'll be crossing over to our first speaker in a minute. So let me just confirm that we are all on track. So what I'll do is I'm going to just run through our program for this morning so you know what's happening. So our first speaker up this morning is going to be Nikki Weimar, who is the Chief Economist of the Nedbank Group. And we are going to be listening to some very interesting and informative information around our economy. And I think the role of women in our economy is critically important, particularly at the time that we find ourselves in. After Nikki's finished speaking, we should be at about 11:15. At 11:15, we will take some questions from you, and then we're going to go and listen to an absolutely inspirational story from one of our senior ladies in agriculture today. So Dipho Ntuli will be joining us at 11 o'clock, and we're going to hear her story about leadership in agriculture and the path that she's taken to achieve what she has. At 11:20, we should be having a few questions again, and if you need to run for the loo at that stage, you're absolutely welcome. And then at 11:30, we're going to meet again, and we're going to continue our inspirational stories with a lady who is involved in agro-processing as a young woman today, her path. And I'm sure that each of these speakers are going to share with you little tips and tools that you're going to be able to use going forward. Our last speaker of the morning, again, is going to be, I can't wait to hear from Deneen, who's the editor of the Farmers Weekly, and many of us know Farmers Weekly, and it's always sort of traditionally known as the man's magazine. Well, we've got a lady at the helm, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what Deneen has to say to us this morning. And that should take us to about 12:30, and again, we'll be able to give you an opportunity for some questions, and at 12:40, we're going to hand over to Dr. Kathy Hurley, who's going to just do a synopsis of the day's events, some of the points that might have come up during the morning, and hopefully by 1 o'clock, we'll be able to say thank you to everybody, and we'll be looking at closing our webinar off at 1 o'clock. So as you can hear, we've got a very busy and exciting morning ahead of us. And as I said, amazing, awesome women speakers. So without any further delays, unless my team have got anything to tell me, I don't hear anything coming through. And I just want to say, please bear with us. This is our first webinar. And I mean, when you get a webinar with 355 or 57 ladies joining, it's just so exciting. So work with us as we also try our best, and I'm sure that we'll all walk away today with having learnt a few things. Some of us maybe a few things about running a webinar, but certainly I'm sure we'll all be inspired as the morning goes on. So I'm going to introduce you to our first speaker this morning. So as I mentioned, Nikki Wehrma is the Chief Economist from the Nedbank Group. And we've asked Nikki to unpack some of the current economic and political influences in South Africa currently. She will share with the webinar the importance and the role of women in the economy. And hopefully, and I'm sure she will, impart some special tools and tips that every woman will benefit from. As I mentioned, she is the Nedbank's Chief Economist. And I can tell you, I've heard Nikki a number of times, and she has certainly got a message to tell and will be able to bring some information that I'm sure many of us haven't heard before. So I'm going to ask Nikki if she would come online now. She is ready to do so, and we're going to be crossing over to her presentation shortly. And I'm going to ask Nikki. Nikki, over to you. Thank you very much, and you're absolutely welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, so my aim today is a simple one in many ways. I am going to try and give you a sense of what to expect in the South African economy going forward. Obviously, we're living in incredibly uncertain times, and the whole world has really been disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic, by the fallout we have seen in the global economy. This has mainly been caused not by the pandemic itself, but by the containment measures that were adopted, and these were severe. Many countries entered complete economic shutdown, only allowed the bare essentials to operate. South Africa, by the way, adopted one of the most bizarrely strict lockdowns of all countries, according to the Johns Hopkins University. And depending on how severe your lockdown is and how quickly a nation managed to control the outbreak of COVID-19, that largely determines how severe the economic impact is. So if we go to the first slide, I think it's important that we just put the whole COVID picture into some perspective and get you up to date where we are now. So if the guys on the other side can just move to the next slide. Yeah, so basically this shows you global cases of COVID, your total number of confirmed cases. This was last updated at the end of last week. It's now over 25 million cases globally. The cumulative number, that top graph, that isn't awfully meaningful because obviously many of them have recovered. But the one that really matters, which shows whether the world is actually winning this battle or not, is the bottom graph. And as you can see, that shows you the rates of transmission. This is the number of new confirmed cases on a daily basis. And so it shows you the rate at which new infections are spreading across the globe. And you can see that the world appears to be approaching almost like a second peak. But COVID-19 is still very much a reality. We haven't put it behind us. There's no signs of us actually, as a globe, as a world, entering sort of the downward slope of the curve. So unfortunately, this is still very much a reality. The good news is there is, I think, over 239 vaccines in development. In Russia, they have fast-tracked the vaccine and they actually started rolling it out. I'm not sure that we would all put our hands up for a Russian vaccine, but everywhere else in the world, the process has been also fast-tracked, but it's been a bit more thorough. Hopefully we will have a vaccine. But in any case, it is still at least 12 to 18 months away from the point where we will have a vaccine. Another encouraging development is that we have seen more effective treatments of the virus across the globe. In South Africa, the use of certain drugs that are generics actually have proved very effective for those that have been very badly influenced by COVID. In the United States, they've now introduced a type of plasma treatment that has also helped to reduce mortality rates. So what we have seen, even though the virus continues to spread, even though it is truly with us, the world at large is treating the virus more effectively, and therefore mortality rates have declined. So that is a little bit of good news. If we go to the next slide, I'm just showing you here where we fit into the picture. That little top slide there shows you the spread of the virus, so your infection rates across the different continents. And you can see that Africa is the green line. And obviously in Africa, there is not nearly as much testing as occurs in the rest of the world. So perhaps it underestimates the spread of the virus on the African continent. But having said that, though, Africa is far less developed than most advanced countries. Their transport systems are less developed. African societies therefore don't move around that much, so the virus don't have the opportunity to spread in the way it would in highly advanced societies where people travel a lot, where people are far more mobile. At the same time, African communities are very close-knit. So if people were falling ill and dying mysteriously, even if they weren't testing, it would have come to some extent, it would have appeared on the radar of the World Health Organization. So although it's probably an underestimation, it is probably also a fair reflection of the trend. And South Africa represents the bulk of the African experience there as far as COVID-19 is concerned. But you can see that really the most alarming movements have been in North America, where the US have primarily been responsible for the decline. But if you look at that little beige line there, it does look as if the US is sort of over its second wave. It's starting to come down. If you look at South America, the red line, you can see that they are truly not handling this virus well. It looked at this as if it was going to follow, sort of form a peak. Then it had a second wave, and it now looks like it's entering a third wave. And then Asia also, we've seen a rapid spread of the virus. India accounts for the largest number of new cases there. And in India, of course, and in South America, they've been reluctant to implement nationwide lockdowns. So they've had localized lockdowns that they have repeatedly had to implement. The outcome, of course, is that the virus has continued to spread. Europe seems to be over the worst, but you can see that yellow line more recently starting to tick up, looking like it's threatening to form a second wave, but still not nearly as steep as that first wave Europe experienced. And in Europe, the bulk of new cases is actually sort of confined to a few countries, Spain and France being on the top of that. And clearly, a lot of that has to do with them opening borders in time for the summer holidays, and that may have facilitated the spread of the virus. In South Africa, the worst appears to be over. Government has said that they, wanted to normalize the curve. If you look at that bottom slide, you can see that it's not really a normal, that it's not that they flattened the curve. It looked to me more like the virus just ran its course. It looks like a pretty normal distribution. And we are now very firmly in the downward slope, which is very encouraging. And as a result, we have seen lockdown eased from level 5, which was bizarrely strict, level 4, which was not a lot less restrictive, but it was infinitely more confusing. We moved to level 3, and then earlier than anyone anticipated, we have moved to level 2, where, the bulk of economic activity is in fact allowed to occur. But of course, health protocols mean that it is often very difficult for companies to have their full staff complement on site all of the time or all at the same time. If you go to the next slide, I just thought, it is perhaps good to have a look at the bigger picture here. If you had to sort of judge South Africa's performance in terms of handling COVID-19, you can see that when it comes to mortality rates, South Africa is among the lowest mortality rates. Our mortality rate have ticked up. It's around 2%, very, very low. We are right there with all the countries that have handled this pandemic best. And for a poor country, for a country with very undeveloped healthcare systems, we have fared better in terms of mortality than many of your very rich Western advanced countries. The big reason for that is not because of the measures adopted by government, although I think it helped. Level 5 lockdown certainly could have been less strict, but it did allow government some space to get the healthcare system ready to deal with the likely influx. And you can see that essentially what has happened is our mortality rates are quite low. And the big reason for that, without a shadow of a doubt, is because we have a very young population. And we know the young are far more immune to this virus than the elderly. And Europe, West, and the US are sitting increasingly with an aging population. And that is why their mortality rates are so high. So as far as COVID-19 is concerned, it's still with us. We can't say that it's over. And therefore, the threat of a reemergence of a second wave is still very much with us as well. And that simply means that we have to adapt. We have to learn to live with this virus. And as a result, we cannot rule out the fact that the economic cost of COVID-19 will continue to sort of ripple through the economy as we go forward. Now we're going to have a look at what's been the impact of not so much COVID-19, the pandemic itself, but really the impact of the lockdowns on South Africa's economy. So if we go to the next slide. Well, this shows you GDP. So what is GDP? It's the value of all goods and services produced in South Africa. This shows you the green bar, that's the quarterly growth rate in the value of goods and services produced in South Africa. So our quarterly economic growth rate, as it is quoted in the press. Then you see those shaded areas, those are official economic downswings, and obviously the white areas are official economic upswings. And then those horizontal bars, the red lines and the yellow lines, gives you the average growth rate during the downswing and during every upswing. And you can see that's from the final quarter of 2013, South Africa entered the downswing. And in fact, we have been in a downswing since. We have not emerged from that downswing. And it is the longest downswing in recorded history, and records began in 1946. So before COVID-19 struck, before the lockdown struck, South Africa entered that crisis in exceptionally bad shape. During this period of downswing, as I said before, the longest in recorded history, our economic growth performance was only 0.7% per annum. We experienced 2 technical recessions. That is when your quarterly GDP contracts for 2 quarters in a row. The latest recession we entered was in the 3rd quarter of last year. You can see that recession deepened in the final quarter of last year, and in the 1st quarter of this year, it deepened even further. It contracted by 2%. What brought us to this situation where we have been stuck in a downswing so long? We are barely growing since 2013, and we have had 2 recessions and are currently stuck in recession. Well, it's not that there was one big event. It is more a case of a lot of adverse factors building up over time and slowly strangling and squeezing the life, especially out of the private sector. And we all know the reasons. From basically 2009, South Africa spent most of its time under President Zuma. That was very poor leadership during his reign. Really, corruption and state capture flourished, especially in the public sector and to some extent also in the private sector. We saw also that government spending ballooned. The bulk of that spending went towards expanding the civil service. So it went towards really employing more civil servants and paying them above inflation wage increases. And really, very early on already, government ran out of money to actually fund this growing civil service. So increasingly, they started to borrow money to pay civil service wages and salaries. So government spending was primarily directed at paying wages and salaries. To give you an idea of all the tax revenue coming in, 45% of revenue simply goes to paying wages and salaries. It's not building roads or hospitals or healthcare clinics or schools. It's not doing any of those things. It's just paying wages and salaries. And of course, at the same time, throughout this period, we had very poor economic policy choices. Governments reach into the private sector in terms of regulations, often very onerous, very high levels of compliance cost required. Just to be legal cost companies a fortune. And then very famously, all our economic infrastructure is provided by state-owned enterprises. Electricity by Eskom, road, rail, road infrastructure by the South African Road Agency, rail and port infrastructure by Transnet, and of course SOEs. Their performance have been shocking over this period. Not only are all of them virtually financially bankrupt, and that they do not earn enough revenue to service their debt and to pay their staff, but basically the service they provided has also been incredibly ineffective. So a tremendous amount of wastage. And of course, we were subjected to power outages. No economy can grow when you don't have access to reliable and cost-effective electricity. And the cost structure of the entire economy lifted in the process. That eroded private companies' ability to compete, and slowly and surely growth just evaporated. This is the position we were in before COVID-19 struck. All right, so you can imagine how bad the effect will be. That's right, go to the next slide, that's perfect. And so just to illustrate you the outcome of this, as government grew, it basically sort of crowded out, that's the term we use, the private sector. And if you look at the key sources of growth in South Africa, you can look at it from the demand side. You can ask yourself, okay, what's been driving growth in South Africa over the last couple of years? And it's essentially been 2 elements: government spending and consumer spending. And those 2 are related because, as I told you, government spends the bulk of its tax revenue on expanding the civil service, on employing more civil servants, on paying them above inflation wage increases. So they are essentially new consumers that have kept consumer spending going. But over time, the private sector declined and shrunk so rapidly that job creation in the private sector have contracted. So the private sector didn't employ more people, and therefore your tax revenue imploded. And as government's tax revenue imploded, government borrowed more, and as it borrowed more, South Africa's sovereign risk rating by the global rating agencies were, deteriorated to the point where we are now universal junk status. And in the process, of course, government had to try and cut spending because it had all of these consumption expenditure items that you cannot not pay somebody's salary. Okay, very difficult to retrench anybody in South Africa. And so the outcome has been that they've cut back on fixed investment. And as a result, what you see is that fixed investment has imploded, becoming a very big drag on the economy's actual performance, its actual economic growth performance. But that implosion in the red line has also started to constrain job creation. Because what is fixed investment, if you think about it? It's when a private company goes and builds a new factory and employs more people. It is when government finally finishes a power station, when it builds more roads, more infrastructure, more schools, more hospitals, more clinics. That is actual capital expenditure. And in the process, more people are employed. So fixed investment really determines how quickly you'll grow in the years ahead, how many goods and services you'll produce, and very importantly, how many people you will employ and how many taxpayers you will create in the process. None of that happened. So as a result of that, as unemployment surged, really consumer spending became slower and slower, and government spending became slower and slower. So really, that's how we landed in this predicament. So next slide. So if you look at the breakdown in that red line, so what's been mainly to blame for this implosion in fixed investment? Well, nobody has grown fixed investment activity. Okay, this is the key to faster growth in the years ahead. Nobody, not the private sector, not government, not state-owned enterprises. But if you look at the private sector, which is the beige line there, at least they've maintained their capital stock. They haven't expanded fixed investment activity, but they've maintained their capital stock. The real drag has come from the implosion in capital expenditure by state-owned enterprises and by government. If we go to the next slide. COVID-19 will make everything worse, okay? So now we know this is an economy that has been driven really by government spending and consumption expenditure, and has been held back by an implosion in capital expenditure by government, static capital expenditure by the private sector, and a very adverse economic environment, which resulted in the economy entering recession before COVID-19 struck. So what we're going to do now very quickly is we're going to look at firstly the impact of COVID-19 on all the key drivers or key economic players in the South African economy, and then we're going to see where is the growth likely to come from. So let's start with government because it now plays such a prominent role in this economy. What's been the impact of COVID-19 on government? Well, as they implemented lockdown, essentially economic demand collapsed. Initially, it wasn't because consumers didn't have money to spend. They weren't allowed to spend money on things like durable goods and clothing and certain services because those facilities were closed during lockdown. So demand imploded. Many companies sat in a situation where they still had to pay all their costs. They had to service their debt, they had to pay their staff, they had to service all their contracts, they had to carry the cost of their inventory, but they got no income in. Absolutely nada, nothing, all right? And in the process, their cash flow got eroded and their profitability declined very sharply, all right? So in this environment, most companies are probably going to report either sharply lower profits or actual losses during the course of this year, which means that government's going to get less from company taxes. At the same time, most individuals are going to find themselves in a situation where maybe they remain employed, but they don't get a bonus and they get much smaller wage increases. And so for the taxes they pay are a lot smaller, or they lose their jobs altogether. And we know that at the moment, the estimates are that unemployment probably increase as a result of the lockdown by about 3 million, and we can barely afford that as it is. So the bottom line is tax revenue is going to be a lot less. Then they banned alcohol, they banned cigarettes, all of those sorts of things where they get sin taxes or excise duties from, and as a result, tax revenue declined even further. So government's tax revenue is going to implode. That's the red line there. But at the same time, COVID-19 has imposed greater burdens on government. They have to support the vulnerable. They have to prepare the healthcare system to deal with the virus. And all of that additional expenditure will mean that government spending will explode. And when Tito Mboweni talked about the hippo's jaws being wide open, this is what he's referring to. That's reflected in this graph. And this gap between government's expenditure and its revenue, well, it will have to fill it through borrowing. Okay, so South Africa is going to run a budget deficit, which is the shortfall between your expenditure and your revenue of 15% of the size of our economy this year. And it's probably going to stay at around 10% for the next 2 to 3 years, which is massive. A sustainable budget deficit is only around 3% of GDP. So you can see how high above that sustainable level South Africa is. Next slide. So what Tito Mboweni did in the supplementary budget is said, listen guys, if we continue on this trajectory, and we don't take any actions to cut government spending, to contain the public sector wage bill, which is the biggest portion of government spending, to right-size government relative to the number of taxpayers in this economy, then this is where our total debt burden as a nation will go. It will rise ultimately by the time we get to 2028, 29, 2020, 30, if you like, to 140% of GDP. Long before that, South Africa will run into a sovereign debt crisis. Ask Argentina what that feels like. Ask Brazil what that feels like. It often results in a decade of lost growth, of growing poverty, of increases in absolute poverty, of increased inequality, of capital flight. It really is not the route you want to take. All right. So, end of the story is that they proposed the green route, which is still going to see the debt burden rise to a peak of almost 90% of GDP by the time we get to 2023-24. But then they'll slowly start to bring it down. A sustainable cutoff for your total debt burden, that is all those annual borrowings to make your expenditure and revenue match, all right, is 60% of GDP. So we're going to be living in the red zone for quite some time, probably for the next decade. So the impact of COVID-19 and of the lockdown on government was truly dramatic. They are in a substantially worse financial position than they were before. And what does it mean in terms of their ability to drive any kind of economic recovery in the months and years and decades ahead? It means they just don't have the money. They're going to have to do the opposite. They're going to have to cut their spending, right? And that simply means that they're going to be a drag on economic growth. So can government create jobs? No, they can't. So if you go to the next slide, so government has to cut. And if they try and spend their way out of this debacle, all that's going to happen is South Africa will be downgraded even further into junk status. What does it mean when global rating agencies downgrade South Africa's sovereign debt? Well, what it means is that there is a higher perceived risk for international investors to financing South Africa's debt. And if they are taking a higher risk, all right, And what is that risk? It's the risk that South Africa will run out of money to service our debt, to pay back both the principal on that debt and the interest on that debt. Now, if there's a higher risk, obviously, what will those foreign investors want? They would want a higher return for taking that risk, which means the government will have to pay a higher interest rate to get any funding for their debt. Now, that means the interest bill on their debt starts to explode and explode, as it is already. It is the fastest growing expenditure item, all right? And it just means you have less tax revenue available to spend on things that really change your citizens' lives, like education, like social welfare, like healthcare, like development, like housing, like land reform, all right? Because interest just eats up everything, all right? So that is the problem. If they try and spend their way out of this, it will just mean a higher interest bill going forward, because you'll just be downgraded even deeper into junk. The next slide. So what is their plan? Their first plan is essentially to try and cut the public sector wage bill. All right, so that's the right thing to do. That is what Tito Mboweni announced in the budget. But of course, that's not going to be easy. They'll have to fight the unions, and the battle has already started if you follow the newspapers. All right, and maybe they will retrench some people, but I don't think under the current circumstances they will. Their aim is simply to stop wage increases, to say to people, listen, we're all in a terrible situation. In the private sector, they are cancelling bonus, they are cutting wage increases. So the civil service must also do its bit, all right, to get us through this difficult bit. Whether they will succeed, whether that argument will hold any sway with the public sector unions, I am not sure. But in any case, that's one of their plans. The other thing that's going to happen inevitably is they're going to cut capital expenditure even further. This is public sector capital expenditure. So as you know, they're already the biggest drag to fixed investment activity, and they're going to remain the biggest drag on fixed investment activity. So next slide. So what does this mean? This has implications for the private sector, because it means South Africa will continue to have to live with a very old, dilapidated economic infrastructure, which is going to tend to push up the cost for the private sector, whether it be road, rail, and port infrastructure. But more importantly, it's going to mean that South Africa will have to live with continued power outages. So for private companies, in this environment, are they going to increase fixed investment? No, all right? They're not going to do it because A, there isn't the power to expand their operations, and B, the economy has imploded. So most private firms are currently sitting with excess capacity. So in other words, they've got spare capacity. Why would they expand their operations even further? So demand will first have to recover before private companies are going to undertake fixed investment. So can private fixed investment be a source of economic growth going forward? Highly unlikely. On the power situation, I had the privilege of hosting Andre de Ruyter, the CEO of Eskom, at a webinar the other day. And he said that there is in fact an increased likelihood of power outages up until November next year. And then they do believe they would have caught up with maintenance, what they call reliable maintenance. The whole idea here being that they actually do more than just standard maintenance. They do a total overhaul of the electricity grid, which is of course almost 35 years old. So it's very old. And also they're hoping that by November 2021, they will at least have in place more units from the new power plants, which of course have been structurally flawed, so also required increased spending simply to get it operating the way it's supposed to be operating. So unfortunately, that means fixed investment by the private sector will also be hurt. If we go to the next slide. All right, so we're really sitting in a very tough situation. We're sitting in a situation where confidence has been eroded. It's very low, both consumer and business confidence. Everybody's anticipating deep recession this year. Consumers are concerned about their job prospects. Many have already lost their jobs. Their incomes have declined as a result. Private companies are primarily concerned with staying alive and staying in business. And that means that they have been cutting back on capital expenditure. They have been borrowing more to shore up essentially their cash flow in order to carry them through this difficult period. So what's been the impact on in the private sector on the various industries? So let's have a look at that. Next slide. This has been the impact of lockdown. To say that it's dramatic would be an understatement of note, all right? That first graph there, all of them show you the same. The red area is level 5 lockdown. The orange area is level 4. The beige area is your level 3 lockdown, and the green is level 2 lockdown. And you can see for mining and manufacturing, the impact of level 5, complete implosion. You had declines really of between 60 and 70%. It was only really coal mining that was still open for business over that period. Then they rebounded quite strongly. But what is worrying here is these numbers take us till the end of June. And what you really would want to see is that the recovery continues, July, August, September. And you can see in manufacturing at the end of June, the recovery continued. But in mining, by the end of June, it started to move sideways again. So still you have a situation where both mining and manufacturing is between 30 to 40% below the levels where they were before we entered the lockdown. If we now look at retail sales at the bottom there, the recovery has been more convincing. Big plunge in level 5, and then quite a nice recovery in level 4. And then in June, we saw again it losing a little bit of momentum. At least it continued to move upwards, but it was losing a little bit of momentum. And that's worrying because we needed to continue to climb to take us at least back to the levels that prevailed prior to the lockdown. And retail sales, 10%. So it's operating at about 90% of the level that prevailed prior to lockdown. If we go to the next slide, but here's the problem. Some industries haven't opened up at all in any meaningful way yet, all right? And that really, unfortunately, often involves industries that employ a lot of people. They are very labor intensive. Here I am talking about restaurants, catering services, hospitality, hotels, B&Bs, lodges, aviation, tourism-related entertainment, cruise ships. All of that is only operating and only recently was allowed to operate on a localized basis. International travel bans are still in place, and it is really the international visitors that provide the key driver to growth in this sector. And if you look at overseas visitors, it's imploded and it hasn't recovered, obviously, because the ban is still in place. And look at the impact it's had simply on the hotel industry. We're not looking at things like car rentals and aviation here. That's not included, just hotel accommodation income. That's been the effect. So this industry is operating at about 6% of its capacity at the moment, which is devastating. And unfortunately, they employ a whole bunch of people, which means that the longer they stay in the state, what you're going to see is increased retrenchments. The next line. All right, so what do we expect? This is what we expect for the different industries. The good news for all of you is you are on the one industry that is anticipated to grow both this year and next year, which is agriculture. You have also been quite immune or less affected by the lockdown because you provide essentials. All right. And honestly, there's a bright future for agriculture in South Africa. And so what I want to tell you is you're in the right industry. Food security has become increasingly important the world over. And what we have seen globally as a trend is that with COVID-19, increasingly focus is being placed on at least producing key essentials, that being food, beverages, and medical supplies within your own country. Because if you have a pandemic, it's very difficult to source them from other countries when restrictions are in place. So because supply chains have essentially been disrupted, that's been the outcome. All right, so South Africa's going to shrink by 8% this year, our biggest contraction ever on record, worse than the Great Depression, and then only recover probably very slowly. The biggest hit over the next few quarters are going to come on the consumer side, because this is likely to be the case. Next slide, for unemployment. You can see unemployment is probably going to increase in the quarters ahead. All right. So I'm going to move on to the final slide here. The one source of support I think you will have throughout this is because the economy is so weak, you're not going to see inflation run away. It's very difficult for wholesalers, retailers to actually increase prices when there's no demand in the system. All right. So ultimately, the only way they can up their sales is by cutting their prices. So that keeps inflation under control. And therefore, we do think interest rates are going to remain at this level, and the Reserve Bank will probably give you another 25 basis point cut at the end of this month. And then it will remain flat for a good 3-year period. So if you have got a mortgage at the bank, maybe now not a bad time to fix your rate, because we are very near the bottom of the rate cycle, and it's probably going to remain at these low levels for an extended period of time. Now, because I'm essentially out of time, I'm going to ask that we skip to the last slide, and you can all have a copy of these slides and look at them, but I just want to wrap up and essentially just point out this. This is more or less what we expect for South Africa. The economy is going to enter deep recession this year. We're already in it. The recovery has started. From the moment we started lifting lockdown, the recovery started. The recovery at this point is not convincing yet. There are going to be a couple of drags on this economy that will keep the recovery very modest. Confine it to 2.7% in 2021, 2% in 2022, 2.5% in 2023. It's not going to be stronger because government's finances are horrific. Therefore, government spending will become a drain on economic activity. Fixed investment will not recover until you actually have a little bit of a revival in demand. And the rise in unemployment will mean that the recovery in consumer spending will also be fairly slow. On the upside, in this whole time, you will probably have very low interest rates and very low inflation. So I hope it makes sense for you. I hope it sheds a bit of light for you on the economy, what to expect. And that's it from me, ladies.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to call it an economics lesson for many, for many of us. And I can tell you from my personal experience, when I grew up, I wasn't ever encouraged to do maths. And in fact, I was told, women should just be typists. You shouldn't actually do accounting. You shouldn't do, economics. We didn't have economics when we were at school. We just literally had typing and maths, and you had to choose. If you didn't do maths, you did typing. So I'm sure for many of us, this morning's information has been extremely informative, and I see there's 1 or 2 questions that have come through, and I know my team have been looking at them, but I've got Dr. Kathy Hurley here with me, and I'm going to just hand over to her. I know she's picked up 1 or 2 questions that she'd like to pose. Kathy, over to you.
Thanks, Nikki. It's Kathy this side. So from my side, obviously you have presented us with a fairly bright future in terms of agriculture going forward. And I think that's probably very exciting for all the women who are on the webinar today. But if you think of all of us sitting in the room here with, we're obviously different stages, different ages, different financial situations, how would you advise us to be able to survive, let's say, the next 12 to 18 months, in order to make sure that our families are more secure and that we're able to get through this, dreadful economic time that we find ourselves in. Thanks, Nikki.
Nikki, just
Yeah.
before you answer, I just want to say, if any of our ladies are out there, you're welcome to use the question button. If you click on, there's a Q&A. It's got little blocks like that you would see in little stories. If you click on there, you're welcome to type a question, and Nikki can also see that, and we can also have a look and we can pass those questions on to. So if you have a question, please keep it specific, keep it focused to what Nikki shared with us this morning, and if you are absolutely welcome to ask those questions. Nikki, sorry, over to you.
Okay, so yeah, to answer that question, I think it depends. If you're running a business, a small business, then I would say, yes, it's difficult times, but you are in the right industry. And there are very many, facilities out there to support, especially farmers and, companies in agro processing. So I would really advise that you contact your banker. We have got the loan guarantee scheme. Small businesses qualify for that loan guarantee scheme. The uptake has not been as high as we would have liked. If you're a client in good standing and you may be experiencing some cash flow problems, banks are quite willing to renegotiate with you and give you, working capital lines and credit facilities to carry you through this difficult period. So that would be the first thing I would advise. As an individual, I would seriously advise that if you're in distress, again, contact your bank. Again, banks are open to renegotiation, but do not just leave it. Do not just default, because that will haunt you for the rest of your life. So that is one thing I would advise if you're in distress. If you're not in distress, I would recommend that you pay off as much of your debt as you can, and that you use this opportunity really to diversify your assets. And the one thing I would definitely advise is that you phone certainly any of the asset managers, whether it be a Liberty, whether it be a Coronation, whether it be Investec, whether it be Nedbank, and you have a chat with one of the wealth advisors and see if you cannot start saving. And if you are saving, I would also recommend that you basically start to look at getting some hard currency behind your name. Whether it be dollars, whether it be euros, whether it be Swiss franc, try and get some hard currency behind your name. In terms of the South African, equity market, I'd be very careful, because it's very narrowly based, and we've mainly seen the run in resources, and a lot of those resource shares are starting to look very, very pricey, and as if we might see a big correction coming. So I would be very wary of that. And then banks also have some good money market, money market instruments that you could put your funds in, where your capital is totally safe. The return you might get is a bit lower than you'd get elsewhere, but you will not lose your capital. So that's also a good vehicle for saving, and most of that is tax deductible. So that will also help you. But as an individual, I would be weary of taking on additional debt.
So on that note, Nikki, I noted we've got a question from Gugu, who actually says, would this be a good time to go and get a loan as a startup company during this economy? So I'll leave that question for you. We've also got another question that's coming from Sianda, and she says, Nikki, you mentioned that fixed capital investment will be a challenge. How does this directly affect agriculture? A question from Colleen that's come through is, how well prepared is the government to respond to the potential that agriculture offers in the current economic climate? Thanks, Nikki.
Okay. Yeah, so if we go to the first question of is it a good period to get a loan as a startup? Banks are open for business. Funding is available. So if you've got a good business plan, you would have a very good chance of getting a loan. At the same time, it's a good time to do it simply because interest rates are low. The other thing that I would also, and likely to remain low for an extended period of time, the other thing I would also advise, really to a large extent, is don't write off property altogether. We've got a situation where land and house prices are at record lows, interest rates are at record lows. So if you are not fearful of South Africa's future, you don't see yourself living in Australia or New Zealand, then, you know, certainly do not be afraid to go out there and invest in property as well. Because at the moment, it really is incredibly cheap. And interest rates are very low, making it a lot easier to finance that loan. And if you do it aggressively and you get ahead of the loan over the next 3-year period when interest rates is low, by the time you get to year 4, 5, where interest rates might start to tick up a little bit, you really have sorted the bulk of the loan, and you sit with an actual asset, which is a source of collateral for you, that you can also apply in your actual business. In terms of fixed investment, you know, how will it affect agriculture specifically? I believe that the biggest impact on the rural economy is really in terms of things like road infrastructure, rail infrastructure, the cost of getting your goods from the farm to the market, and obviously also the risk of electricity outages. Now, to the extent that you may be using renewable energy or generators, or you're not a heavy energy user, agriculture is in a slightly better position than, say, mining and manufacturing on the energy front, but it is still going to be an additional cost. So what is the collapse in fixed investment by government going to do to agriculture specifically? It's going to increase the cost of logistics. That's what it's going to do. Oh, final question. It was about the potential, just repeat that one to me. Oh, how prepared is government to actually exploit the potential of agriculture? Right, on that front, government's not prepared for anything. So agriculture, mining, manufacturing, it's irrelevant. But I can tell you that it is something that government have acknowledged could be a source of great empowerment in South Africa. And it certainly featured very strongly in President Ramaphosa's State of the Nation address. Government is also wanting to accelerate land reform in a way that is not destructive, even though the constitution has been changed. Government's put aside more state land to accelerate land reform. Hopefully the land will go to people that actually have the skills to work it and put it to productive use, because that's really the key. But I think that there are many Africans that have that skill, and if they could actually get a piece of land and they get proper support, that's the other very important thing. Proper support in terms of technology transfer, in terms of availability to credit, in terms of support from agricultural bodies and perhaps private farmers, then you could unlock great growth potential. And I think that's government's plan. How jacked up their actual structures are at this point, I question. I think it's probably not there, but the sentiment is there. The desire to see agriculture play a bigger role and really empower a greater portion of the South African society, that is definitely there.
Thanks, Nikki. I think in KZN, you know, we have many women in agriculture, and for most of them, it's quite a challenge to actually get land. You know, I mean, we've just been dealing with the Ultra Bill, for example, and it's also quite a challenge sometimes to get government to hear us. And,
Yeah.
you know, we've been talking for a long time, and, you know, we have to continue to sort of shout to make our voices be heard. And it's really a challenge. And I mean, you know, we talk so glibly about women in agriculture, but whilst we have so much to add, and we can definitely make a difference in this country and contribute to the economy through what we do in agriculture, it's to convince and to get government and stakeholders to trust us, and that we can actually achieve and that we can make a difference in this country. So yeah, I mean, we're ready for that. And I think today's registration just of our small initiative just to me demonstrates so much that there are many women that have a role to play, and we are constantly saying, how can we play that role? How can we influence that which is taking place in South Africa? I see there's just one last question that's come through from a young lady who she says, I'm 21 years old, I'm a student, can I be granted a loan? And I think she's obviously also looking at how she can take her business forward. Thanks, Nikki.
Absolute pleasure.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for your time today, Nikki. We really appreciate what you've shared with us, and I welcome you. If you have any further questions, you're please welcome to use the Q&A. Drop your questions on there, and we'll endeavor to get them answered. So I hope you've all perhaps learned something. I know I certainly have. And as women in this country, we have a role to play. We can make a difference. And I think today is a starting point for us to say, how can we do that? And I'm sure during the course of the morning, through the rest of the speakers and through our synopsis at the end, I'm sure we're going to come up with some way forward. So I see we are on time. We are doing very well in terms of our agenda this morning. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to help you just to rest your brain a little bit in terms of the numbers that we saw on the screen and all the graphs flying ahead of front of us there.